One of the major benefits that many people think of when they think of grass-type Pokemon is the ease that you have when you feed them. After all, most of them, like the Oddish line that we've already covered in the series, are able to pull nutrients from the ground itself, thanks to their plant-like biology. Even those that are still more animal than plant can do this, as seen with Bulbasaur and its ability to partially sustain itself off sunlight. But what happens when the grass type circles right back around to being carnivorous again? Well, you end up with the Bellsprout line. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon lines in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the Bellsprout line. Bellsprout itself stands at an average of 2 foot 4 inches and weighs about 9 pounds. They have a very thin stem-like body with 2 root-like legs, and 2 wide green leaves on either side where its arms should be. The head is bright yellow and shaped like an upside-down pitcher, where the opening of the pitcher is where Bellsprout's mouth is. This mouth is surrounded by a pink ring that I think serves the same function as lips, and it has 2 small beady eyes. Upon evolution, its entire body plan changes. Where before the pitcher was just its head, it's now its entire body, losing the semi-humanoid shape that it had before. Think of it as just a massive yellow head, with a large mouth on the bottom and a small brown stem on the top that it uses to hang from trees and other high up places. It still has the 2 green leaves on either side of its head, and the eyes have gotten larger, so now that you can see the sclera around the iris. Weepinbell is slightly larger than its pre-evolution as well, now being 3 foot 3 inches and 14 pounds. And if you were to leave them be, that's where the evolution line would end. But once a Weepinbell is exposed to a Leaf Stone, they evolve once again into a Victreebel. As a Victreebel, they gain a massive increase in size, growing to be 5 foot 7 inches tall. However, they really don't weigh that much, only being 34 pounds on average, as most of their body consists of empty space thanks to their massive mouth. If you take Weepinbell's body shape and flip it upside down, you would generally get what Victreebel looks like. The mouth is now at the top of the Pokemon instead of the bottom. It has 2 sharp teeth inside it, and the eyes have moved upward to just underneath the mouth. The mouth also now has a leaf-like covering that the Pokemon can use to trap prey in its mouth, as well as a long vine-like tail that extends from the leaf covering. Its yellow body is now a mottled greenish-brown. As you can tell from the unique shape of its body and the fact that past the first evolution they don't have any way to pull nutrients from the ground, this line looks like it's going to offer some interesting takes on caring for a grass-type Pokemon. So let's get into it and see if these Pokemon could be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. Right away, we're looking at a fully enclosed enclosure. These are very tropical Pokemon. I mean, sure, they could deal with cooler climates if they have to, such as with the Johto or the Kanto regions, but it's not ideal for them. It can stunt their growth and stress them out a lot. Their best environments are jungles, places where the heat never really goes away and the humidity is always like walking through soup. That means that unless you live in a place like that, then you need to make that habitat for them. Thankfully, past the Bellsprout stage, they're very sedentary Pokemon, as they're ambush predators, meaning they tend to spend most of their day just hanging out and waiting for prey to come to them. So you aren't going to be looking at something the size of a Zubat or an Oddish enclosure. Instead, you'll need something that's at least 15 feet by 15 feet for Bellsprout and Weepinbell, and if you do plan on going all the way to a Victreebel, then you should increase the size of it to 25 by 25 feet. The roof for both of these sizes can be anywhere between 15 feet tall and up, and that's mostly to fit the decorations, which we'll cover in a bit. While they don't often move, you will need the space to make your Pokemon feel more comfortable and also provide them with enough environment to feel that they're hidden. As for the walls of the enclosure, this will be built almost exactly like a greenhouse. The walls and ceiling should be made out of an opaque glass or plastic, something that's clear enough that it'll allow the sunlight to come in, but clouded enough to prevent the full harshness of direct sun. This will also help to keep the internal temperature high, as these Pokemon thrive best at temperatures between 65 and 85 degrees. Honestly, not that bad, but it's the humidity that'll make it feel a lot hotter than it actually is. Bellsprout and its evolutions do best at humidity levels between 70 and 85%, which means that just stepping inside of this enclosure will mean you're going to start sweating. Tropical regions like this can be brutal if you aren't used to them. Now, speaking of the inside, the first thing you're going to need is a good layer of dirt, something that's at least 2 feet deep. You don't really have to worry about the nutrient content of the soil too much with these guys like you do with the Oddish line, as they get most of their nutrients from the insects and prey they consume. The only exception to this is Bellsprout, which will root its feet to get water. So for the soil, you're going to need a combination of things that'll hold water well without allowing too much excess water to sit in your enclosure. What you should have is a mixture of 30% perlite, which is a form of processed volcanic rock that is great at holding and draining excess water, and 70% sphagnum moss, which is also great at holding in water. This means that any water you add to your enclosure won't just drain away easily or evaporate away quickly in the high heat of the enclosure. Use this mixture to form the soil level of your enclosure. As for other decorations, you're going to want plenty of other foliage for your Pokemon to camouflage themselves in. They can be either real or fake, though if you get the real ones, then you need to make sure that they're able to live in the same environment that you're building for your Bellsprout evolution. You'll want some shrubs or bushes along the ground that your Bellsprout can hide in, as well as high up perches that your Weepinbell and Victreebel can hide in, like branches or different poles that they can hang from and are slightly obscured while they do so. You'll also need to provide them with some shade, as long exposure of direct sunlight can be bad for them long term. The best solution that I've found has been to get a few fake trees that you can place along the sides of the enclosure. They'll provide your Pokemon with plenty of vertical space that they need, while the leaves of the tree will provide all the shade they need as well. Just be sure to get ones that are able to fit inside the building, and to anchor them deep into the soil so they don't fall and hurt one of your Pokemon. And really, that's it for decorations. Sure, there are a few small things that you'll have to do, like get a sealed door that won't let moisture out when it's closed, or get a vent somewhere up near the top of your building that you can open if the humidity starts to get too high, but that's all maintenance stuff that you'll have to do for this enclosure that we'll cover later on in this care section. When talking about Pokemon that can be housed with these Pokemon, you need to be very careful. These Pokemon will try to make a meal out of anything that's smaller than they are. Anything that they think can fit inside their mouth means that they're going to try to eat it. And with Victreebel, they may still try to eat it even if it's too big. They have a habit of taking down large prey and then using their leaves to cut it into small, eatable chunks. So you need something that is tough enough to either withstand them or to make them not even think about trying to go after it. On top of that, you need to make sure that the other Pokemon won't go after your Bellsprout evolution in turn. Being mainly grass types, they can be prey to a lot of larger predators, though their poison typing does help to ward off some of the smaller ones. On top of that, you'll also have to think about if the other Pokemon is fit to live in the same environment as Bellsprout and its evolutions. After all, no ice type is going to be comfortable in those conditions. And between not needing to be prey to the Bellsprout line, not needing to prey on the Bellsprout line, and having to survive in a tropical environment, it might be tough to find something that'll be able to peacefully coexist with your Bellsprout evolution inside this enclosure. Well, aside from other Bellsprout line Pokemon. They tend to get along with each other fairly well, even to the point where it's been observed that Victreebel collect and store any leaf stones they find, so to give them to other Weepinbell. So, if nothing else, they can at least be housed with one another. And do always keep in mind that the enclosures that I describe in these guides are only designed to house one Pokemon. If you decide to get another one, then you will have to expand the enclosure accordingly. Availability. Surprisingly, despite the fact that the only really tropical region is Alola, they're actually more abundant in the Kanto region than anywhere else. I mean, they're almost on every route surrounding Saffron City, nearly the entire east coast of Kanto from Lavender Town to Fuchsia City, and even the few routes that are north of Celadon City have a good population of these Pokemon. And it's not just Kanto. As the Sprout Tower indicates, there are good amounts of Bellsprout around Violet City over in Johto. Now, that's not to say that they're everywhere. Hoenn, Unova, Galar, and mainland Paldea all don't have any Bellsprout populations, and the remaining regions may have some Bellsprout populations, but they're confined to only a few different routes. But as you can see, despite how good a tropical environment is for these Pokemon, they've been able to spread and thrive in all these different kinds of places. And thrive they do, as they are very common in areas where they live. If you are able to get to where they live, then you should have no problems finding a Bellsprout or even a Weepinbell. The one that you might have some trouble finding is a Victory Bell, as they need a Leaf Stone to get to that stage. But on the other hand, Leaf Stones are more common than any of the other elemental stones, so there is a higher chance of finding them in the wild than other stone evolutions. When it comes to breeders though, there's a moderate presence of these Pokemon in the breeding scene. As we'll get to, these Pokemon aren't that bad to take care of, and the fact that you can raise many of them together with no problems means that keeping and breeding large amounts of them can be very easy. But then again, needing to build an entire enclosure to house them can be a big impediment to many people trying to get into breeding these Pokemon. After all, why get Pokemon that need this specialized enclosure when you can instead get a grass Pokemon line that you can just keep outside, like the Oddish or the Cherubi lines? So, in the end, yeah, you'll be able to find someone who will be able to sell you one of these Pokemon, but you just may have to take some time to find them. Catchability. Yeah, you heard that right. I've decided to add a new category to the care guides from now on. The reason that I'm doing this is simple. My view on Pokemon has always been slightly skewed. I was raised on a farm where my parents raised and sold Pokemon. I moved to the Sinnoh region and set up my own farm where I raise and breed Pokemon. I've spent my entire life surrounded by this kind of life and never really saw the point in going out and catching my own Pokemon when there was someone out there that would sell me one of whatever I wanted. And I still hold that opinion to be true, but I recognize that a big part of interacting with Pokemon and many young people interacting with the world is by catching their own Pokemon. The first time you throw a Pokeball and catch a wild Pokemon can oftentimes become a treasured memory for many people. And there are many Pokemon species out there that are really only available to those that are willing to go out and catch them for themselves. To that end, I've decided to add into this part of the guide for those of you that want to know how easy it'll be to catch the Pokemon that the guide is about, as it's often information that I've just kind of lumped into the availability section, if I mention it at all. Which brings us back to the Bellsprout line. These Pokemon can be tricky to find and catch. Being ambush predators, they tend to lie in wait for prey to come to them, all while blending in with the surrounding environment. So, if you are going to go out hunting for one of these Pokemon, be sure to keep your Pokemon by your side at all times, and keep your eyes peeled. The worst thing that you could do when hunting for one of these Pokemon is to get surprise attacked. Thankfully, these aren't the most aggressive species that you can go looking for, and often, if they've just eaten anytime near when you pass them by, they'll leave you alone while they digest. A good hint that I've constantly seen online is to always look up. While Bellsprout tends to stay on the ground and can be the easiest of them all to find, the stronger two evolutions are very arboreal, sticking to staying up in the tree branches before striking at prey. In the end though, as long as you see them coming, then they shouldn't be too much of a threat. A good flying or fire type Pokemon will be able to protect you from them long enough for you to get them in a Pokeball. Once in the Pokeball, they don't seem to put up too much of a fight either, though that can change with the individual and the evolution stage they're in, with the latter stages of course being harder to catch and possibly needing more Pokeballs. In all, they can be anywhere from an easy to moderate challenge to catch. Care. A large part for caring for these Pokemon is going to be feeding. Normally, with a Pokemon that is as much plant as these guys are, you wouldn't really need to worry about feeding them. Pokemon like this tend to get most of their nutrition from the soil and the sun. But Bellsprout and its evolutions, despite being plant-based life, actually are carnivorous. They tend to feed on small bug Pokemon, as well as small mammals, small birds, really anything they think they can take down is a potential prey item. So you're going to need to feed them meat. Thankfully, they are still plant-based and do get some of their nutrition from the sun by using the broad leaves that all of them have. Combine that with the fact that they seldom move during the day when trying to attract prey, and you'll find that they don't really eat that much. For Bellsprout, a Cutie Fly or two twice a week or so should hold them over nicely. For Weepinbell and Victorybell, you'll want to upgrade that to a Caterpie once a week for Weepinbell and twice a week for Victorybell. Of course, the food should be frozen and then thawed out when you plan on feeding them to your Pokemon. I don't recommend live feeding ever because it can easily lead to your Pokemon being injured by the prey. How you feed them is rather easy though. First things first is that you need to locate where your Pokemon is in the enclosure. After all, they are most likely hiding among the foliage and decorations that you've provided. Once you find them, head inside the enclosure with the defrosted food, slowly approach your Pokemon, making sure to show that you mean no harm, but also showing that you know where they are and that you don't fear them. The latter part will help to reinforce the idea that you are not meant to be taken as prey. Once you get close enough, within roughly 10 feet or so, take the food and place it on the ground and walk away. After you leave and close up the enclosure, the Pokemon will come over and take the food. A nice side benefit to this is that over time, the Pokemon will start to see you as less interloper in their territory and more of a food provider and friend. It might never get to the point where they approach you for food, but after some time they should allow you to get close enough to touch them and feed them by hand, which is important when you get to the pruning that you'll have to do later. Though I will add that it's generally much easier to befriend a Bellsprout and Weepinbell than it is to befriend a Victorybell, due to their position in the food chain. Victorybell is much higher in the food chain and has less natural predators to fear, meaning that they are less inclined to work with other species. Bellsprout and Weepinbell, however, do have natural predators that they need to keep an eye out for. Combine that with the fact that they're oftentimes less powerful than a Victorybell, and you should have an easier time getting them to trust you. So before evolving your Weepinbell, you may want to work on building that trust between you and your Pokemon. That way, it's already established when they evolve. And, like I said, the best way to build that trust is with food. Now that we've talked about the food, I want to also mention the acid. The way that these Pokemon digest their food is that they have a very strong acid inside their mouths. This acid gives off a very sweet scent, which is then used to draw prey within striking distance. The reason that I bring this up is because that acid is very strong, as I've already said. It usually has a pH between 2 and 3, meaning that if it comes into contact with your skin, it can cause some severe burns. This shouldn't be too much of an issue. After all, to come into contact with the acid, you would have to be inside the Pokemon's mouth. And at that point, I'm guessing you have other things to worry about. But to be on the safe side, Always be sure to have both a neutralizing agent nearby that you can use to get rid of the acid on your skin, as well as a burn kit to treat any injuries that you received. It's always better to be prepared for the unlikely scenario, that way you aren't unprepared when that scenario does eventually happen. Let's bring that trust we mentioned before back into the picture now. Once you've managed to build up enough trust with these Pokemon that they allow you to touch and interact with them, that's when the pruning will start. It's nothing major, but as all of these Pokemon grow, the leaves on their sides and the vine on your Victory Bell will need pruning. You'll see that a small bud of a new leaf will begin to appear at the base of the old one, while at the same time the older and bigger leaf will start to brown and wither at the edges. It's nothing to worry about, but do keep an eye on it. Once the new leaf gets big enough, it should force the old leaf to detach and fall to the ground, replacing it. However, sometimes the old leaf can get stuck. If it remains there, attached to the Pokemon, then it can cause some health problems by impeding the growth of the new leaf and causing sickness to set in as the old leaf begins to rot. A good idea for this is that once the old leaf has become mostly brown, begin to tug on it. Gently, not too hard. If the leaf is ready to come off, then it should just pull right off the Pokemon's body with no issue. If it doesn't, then wait a few more days and try again. The health of your Pokemon shouldn't be a concern until the leaf has turned completely brown. If at that point the leaf still refuses to come off, then you may want to take your Pokemon to the Pokemon Center. That way a registered nurse can take a look at them and see if there's a deeper problem going on. The last thing that we should talk about care-wise for these Pokemon is regarding the water. Be sure to never let the enclosure dry out. The ground should always be moist, the air should always be humid, and there should always be water supplied for the Pokemon to drink from. This is important as the water helps them produce the acid that they use to eat, and if that acid dries out, it can be a major health risk to the Pokemon itself. The only issue is that they can't drink from a bowl or anything similar, as they don't have a tongue or a throat or anything near a normal digestive system. The way that they get fluid in the wild is through their food and through rainwater. So you have two options. One is that you can install a sprinkler system in the enclosure that'll water them enough that the Pokemon and the environment doesn't dry out. Or you can decide to make sure they get enough water through their food, whether that be by having the food itself be very wet, or by injecting water into their food to create a pocket of water inside of it. I would generally go with the second method, as it comes to be less expensive and easier in my opinion. But the sprinkler system does mean that you don't really have to worry about remembering to give your Pokemon their water, and it does tend to take care of the entire enclosure at the same time. Cost. Food won't be that much. With the little amount that these Pokemon eat per month, you shouldn't be in more than the low category for Bellsprout and the moderate category for Weepin' Bell and Victory Bell. And the plus side is that you can order their food in bulk, freeze whatever you aren't using at the moment, and it should keep for way longer. This means that not only could you get a bulk discount from wherever you're buying it from, but that you won't have to worry about getting more food for some time. The Pokemon itself will cost more than the food to get, mostly because there aren't an abundance of people that are raising and selling these Pokemon. A lot of people are weirded out by having to feed bugs to their plants. After all, the main reason that many people go for grass-type Pokemon is because a lot of their feeding methods are nice, easy, and don't involve meat. But, that being said, there still is a niche market out there for these Pokemon, which helps to balance out the price somewhat. You're probably looking at the moderate category for the first two evolutions, but that might jump up to the high category for a Victory Bell simply for the price of the stone that the breeder will have to buy. And lastly, the Enclosure is going to put you in the very high category. It won't be as expensive as building something like the Poliwag's Enclosure, or thank Arceus, the Zubat Enclosure, but you are still going to have to build a fully encapsulated enclosure that can sustain high humidity and high temperatures. This, unfortunately, means that you're staring down the barrel of an investment in the very high category. Conclusion. Personally, I like the Bellsprout line. They're very unique looking Pokemon with the big yellow bodies that function as mostly mounts. They're also the rare Pokemon line that starts bipedal and loses that as they evolve. And for me, I think I'd enjoy the act of raising them and keeping them. But that's not to say they're for everyone. The ambush predator style of these Pokemon, along with the presence of the acid, could prove a hard challenge to a newbie that hasn't raised many Pokemon before. I would say that these are more intermediate Pokemon, good for someone who has gotten used to taking care of the easier to raise Pokemon and is looking for a challenge without it being dangerous. If that just so happens to be you, then I think that these could very easily end up becoming the perfect Pokemon partner for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join me again next time when we cover the persistent pest of the ocean, Tentacool, and its evolution Tentacruel. Have a wonderful night, everyone.